right, so we are here with Austin Valle. Me and Austin go somewhat way back. We've known each other for a long time, but I've been. I told you when we talked originally a couple weeks ago that I've been following you from afar in some of your hobbies and passions that you've been pursuing. So, why don't you give us a little introduction on yourself, who you are, and then we'll go from there.
Sure, that sounds great. And thanks so much, Justin, for the chance to come and have this conversation. Like you said, we've known each other for, really decades. I mean, I grew up in Central Florida and have spent most of my life here. And as I think many of us we have experienced with the housing market. People we love have experienced the housing market. We see it on the front page of the newspaper, on news sites, every day, really even before COVID, but it has really accelerated since then, the last couple of years for some important reasons. But even before that, for a long time, there's been some affordability issues around housing in the area. I live in Orlando, city of Orlando, in College Park specifically. And so I'm most familiar with Orlando, and our work touches at Orlando YIMBY, and of course I'll talk a little bit more about Orlando YIMBY is. We focus on Orange County specifically, and then city of Orlando in particular, some into Winter Park a little bit, but this is where we're sort of anchored. And so, about a year ago or so, I was just looking to get more involved in my community for a bunch of reasons. As you know, had a baby, reflected on what am I doing with my life, how do I get more involved in my community in some way. And so I reached out to some people that I knew that were involved in some various ways, mostly around educating the public, writing about transportation, around housing. Right. And I just asked, hey, how can I volunteer? I just want to give a little bit of my time here and there, be part of something. And everybody that I asked at least said, what you're talking about doesn't really exist here, or nothing's quite like that. And so one person I asked, and he said, well, that doesn't exist, but why don't we do it? Let's jump into it. And so he and I were the nudge that each other needed, and we embarked on this journey that eventually ended up to be us starting this organization that's called Orlando YIMBY. And for those who might not be aware, which I think many at this point still are not, YIMBY stands for Yes in My Backyard. And we are a pro-housing organization. We advocate for housing abundance, and we position ourselves against what maybe some people have heard of, which is a NIMBY, which is somebody who says, yes, we need more housing. Yes, we need these sorts of things in our communities, but not in my backyard. Right. And when everybody says that over and over again, then there's no place that this sort of housing is being built. And so what we wanted to be was just a voice in the conversation around making sure that we are building enough housing. And so we've been around for about a year or so. Again, we focus mainly in Orlando, though other parts of Orange County as well, especially near UCF and other spots like that. And we advocate for more housing and more affordable housing. So oftentimes this is income constrained housing, but oftentimes it's not. Oftentimes it's just, we need more housing, full stop. We believe in supply and demand. And when prices are too high, you need supply, or you need to reduce demand, but that you don't want to reduce demand of people, that gets ugly. So the other way to fix that is to increase supply. And so that's how we seek to solve a lot of issues. Affordability is one of them. There's more than that as well, but that's mainly what we focus on.
So what is your background? Walk me through that a little bit, and that obviously drove you to this point to some extent. So what's that look like?
Yeah, so my education is in economics, and then I have my graduate degree in public policy. And I had done some policy work early on in my career, but then my career took a complete shift. And I work in the media and entertainment industry today, doing business development work that really has nothing to do with this advocacy work that I do. But I love my job. I find a lot of fulfillment in it, but I'd always had this itch to stay plugged into that work that I used to do, and that my education was in. And so absolutely, as that it started, I couldn't quite find the right way to scratch it. And so that is definitely a big part of what led me here to this, is finding something outside of my day job that could fulfill another part of me that I had always wanted to have be fulfilled. And look, I think I tap into a lot of the skills and competencies that I've learned in my business career, my professional career, that have lent themselves into this advocacy work that we do, right? We do a lot of communication, we do a lot of writing, a lot of relationship building that I've learned in my professional career that I think has helped in that advocacy work as well. And look, there's a lot that I still don't know, when it comes to advocacy and organizing, because that's not what my background is. But I think that I also can bring something new to those circles because of my background. And it's all about being humble in the spots that you don't know much, if anything, but also being comfortable with and confident enough to say, hey, I do bring this skill set. Why don't we think about doing it like this, and hoping to add something to what we're trying to do in that way.
I often think passion overcomes that lack of advocacy background, right? People can get behind somebody who's passionate about something. So I think far too often we see advocates who, really have no opinion on the subject. They just like advocating, right? So
yeah, there's been some fun, to your point. I mean, when you're passionate about it, you have a really clear worldview.
Right.
And you can have great conversations with people who disagree with you or who agree with you. But sometimes it's jarring to walk into conversations with people who don't care at all, but they're in a position where I would expect you to have a position one way or the other, but it's just a blank canvas. And sometimes that can be good. Sometimes it's not so easy to advocate or to organize with those folks. But yeah, it's passion can get you a long way.
So a couple of things. I'm glad you told me how to say YIMBY. I knew what it stood for. I didn't know if it was just an acronym or if you pronounce it like that. So that's a good clarification for me. But as you know, I'm pro housing as well. I'm in the real estate industry. So kind of following you from afar and kind of watching some of the stuff you've written on is what kind of intrigued me to have this conversation, because I think it's certainly interesting. And you probably find yourself surrounded by a lot of different, outside of this particular topic, people, backgrounds, political views. It seems like it covers a wide spectrum of people. And so that's why I'm kind of interested to kind of peel back some of the layers and understand a little bit more about ultimately what the goals are. So you want to go into that? I mean, is there kind of a few set basic, kind of goals of YIMBY?
Yeah, absolutely. I'll give you the goals, and then I'll speak to the point you're making, which is such an important one, which is the weird cross-cutting across different types of organizations who might be attracted to it. But our goals in short is to build more housing. And especially what we say is to build housing near opportunity. So we especially want to focus on building housing near jobs, building housing near transit, which Orlando does now have some. 15 years ago, it was a different story, but we do have that. And so we want to focus on building housing near that. And so that's what we focus on is building more housing in those places. We do so, at least we frame these, there's a lot of reasons why you would want to, but we focus on three particular reasons. One is affordability. I mentioned supply and demand earlier. We've seen some data from the census that says that over the last 10 years, the population of Greater Orlando has increased at a rate of 1.5 times as fast as the housing supply. So we're just out of whack. The rental vacancy rate is something like 5%, which is considered full in the industry. You want something closer to 10-15% vacancy to start to see prices start to tick down. And then I'm sure you know this, the article that came out recently said that the Realtors Association has been measuring number of homes for sale over the last few decades, and we just hit a record low number of homes for sale. And so we view this, again, supply and demand, that there's a supply issue, and then that's driving a lot of the affordability issues that we see here in Orlando. The second is for environmental reasons. So again, as we focus on building housing near opportunity, near transit, near jobs, that can reduce commutes. It can reduce our need to build over wetlands, build over forested areas. We would instead prefer to build where we're already built out. Let's take a Fashion Square Mall, a giant mall that's dead or dying in a big parking lot. Let's put some housing there so that we don't have to go build more housing, further out into East Orange County where there isn't anything built yet, and we'd have to build some highways out there. So the second is the environmental one. And then the third is economic development. When we think about, I like to say that the best thing you can do for a restaurant is put 4 floors of housing on top of it. Now they have a customer base who can go and buy housing there, or excuse me, buy food there. Yeah. So we want to bring people near to commerce. I think too a lot about gentle density, walkable developments. There is seemingly no end to consumer demand for good urbanism. People spend thousands of dollars to go to travel to Amsterdam or Boston or Copenhagen or Paris or London and just walk around for a week or a day even sometimes. And so we think a lot about, people will go seek out Baldwin Park for the night just to go enjoy dinner or go do some activity. We need to be building out these neighborhoods that attract businesses, that attract customers. 75 million people a year already visit Greater Orlando. So let's go build some of these neighborhoods out that are in our city, capture some of those eyeballs and some of those dollars, build them a train that gets them right there. And that's economic activity. That's the kind of commerce that we want to see. So it's all these things combined. And that's why, to your point, Justin, it's a really interesting space where we have some strange bedfellows that are part of this alliance to try to do this sort of thing. You have some folks who are mainly focused on poverty alleviation and helping support those folks who can't afford a place to live. We also attract environmentalists and people who are trying to preserve green space or reduce commutes or focus on public transit. And then absolutely, there's a strong interest from the business community as they think about, we're attracting jobs here, but then are those individuals, do they have to go live out in Lake County because there's no place to live? Well, now sometimes we just paid a business to move here, but their employees are living out in Lake County. So we're only recapturing a portion of that value, or just in general, we want that growth to occur here because that economic growth can lift folks throughout the region. And so we found some interest there. So there's a lot of ways to come to it, but we think there's a lot of reasons to want to build more housing, and that attracts different people depending on what their priority is.
So one thing I talk to people a lot when they're looking at Orlando, looking at moving here, and I feel like just the way I've framed it, is we've almost started burrowing a little bit, kind of like the suburbs around New York, right? Manhattan, right? Where you do have some areas that are their own pockets. People don't leave their pockets if they can help it. I find it funny around town. People are like, well, where should I live? Windermere, Winter Park, or Oviedo? And it's like, you've got to talk to people in all of these areas. However, the people in Windermere, they only love Windermere, right? And they're gonna downplay Winter Park, and Winter Park's gonna downplay Windermere. And it's like everybody has their thing, and it's because it works for them or whatever it is, or their communities there. But it is interesting. A lot of these areas have started building, and I'm in Oviedo right now. Kind of Oviedo on the Park has kind of built its own little downtown pocket, and we're seeing this across town, which is really cool. It's definitely a lifestyle increase, I think, for a lot of people when they can be close to that, live, work, and play in the same area.
I 100% agree. I think that's, look, I mean, what are we, we're trying to build communities, right? That's what, when we talk about housing is just a part of a community. And what we want to do is build communities, build neighborhoods that people want to live and find fulfillment in those neighborhoods. We have, as you know, in City of Orlando, we have these Main Street districts. And some of what you're talking about follows those, right? I live in College Park, so it's a College Park Main Street district. We have Edgewater that runs along it. You have the Mills 50 Main Street district. You have Audubon Park. And part of, we think, a way to empower those main streets is, again, to bring more people into them, build up a little bit, give them some more amenities, some character to each of them, so you have more people who can live in them and contribute to them and support those businesses. There's definitely some main streets in Orlando that, those businesses struggle because there's some of them are really cool businesses, but there's not a lot of residents who live near there because it's, low density, even close to downtown. And so it's hard to support those. The other one that's an interesting data point that we've started to track recently, and I don't remember the percentage in front of me, but I can picture the Venn diagram of people who live in City of Orlando and people who work in City of Orlando. And there's actually not a lot of overlap between those things at all.
Right.
And so that is one metric that we think that our policymakers should at least think about, is helping people work and live in the same spot. And how do you do that? There's different ways that you can think about doing that. But part of that is letting people, having more housing opportunities for people to do that. You'd have to rethink transportation in some ways, but that's what we want, right? It's sort of to your point too, how it sort of cuts across politics in some ways. In some ways, progressives are very attracted to that, mass transit, these communities, but also it's also sort of old-fashioned conservative idea of these communities and neighborhoods where you work, you shop, you go to church, you go to school with the same people, you build out this tight-knit community that when you don't have a sufficient level of people who can live there because you don't have the density to support it, those communities kind of get torn apart over time and become more transient. And it kind of cuts against that kind of old-fashioned American ideal of what a neighborhood is.
I think where the rubber meets the road and kind of goes to my next question of like, I think the difference in the political persuasions is how do you achieve it, right? We could all have the same vision. The conservative would say, well, let the developers do their thing. They're gonna, do build where the demand is, versus government building housing everywhere, right? And so it sounds like we're somewhere in the middle there. So what's the proposal? What are you finding working and being effective across the lines?
Yeah, the way that we sell for that is we say all of the above, right? We say, and this is something that I've learned as I've got into this, and I think maybe a lot of folks don't even necessarily realize that, is that a lot of the reason there isn't the density in our cities, and again, here I'm specifically talking about, our neighborhoods that I live 1.5 miles from downtown. So I'm in one of these, what we often call these bungalow neighborhoods around the downtown area, is that there's actually government regulation that's preventing there from being any more density. It's often very boring, but this is where to your point, where the rubber meets the road, is there's these zoning maps in the city that says what type of housing that you're allowed to build there, and how many parking spots you're required to build, and how big the lot has to be, and how much the lot you have to go use. And all these rules make it such that in most instances, you're actually only allowed to build a detached single family home. Even 1.5 miles from downtown, we're talking, you can only build that sort of housing. And so what we're saying is we need to loosen up some of those rules to allow us to build. Look, I'm not saying let's build a skyscraper in the middle of College Park, but how about a duplex? How about a fourplex? How about this, what we call this, sort of 3-story walk-up garden style apartment? This is what we refer to as this gentle density, to build out a little bit more in this, what is really, I would consider, our urban core, to build out, let more folks move in there. And again, this isn't a mandate. This isn't saying you have to build a fourplex. If you want a single family home there, you can have a single family home there. But we think that we should at least let homeowners, property owners, builders, if the market demands it, to be able to build that level of density, some 4 units, maybe 6 units, something like that. So that's one piece of it, is we do feel like there are too many rules and regulations there that is arbitrarily tamping down on the supply that otherwise would be there. I feel confident even around my house here, all the time, people are tearing down a smaller single family home and building up a bigger single family home. Right. We would love that builder and that property owner to have the option to, instead of putting back up one single family home, put up a duplex, put up a triplex, because that's going to over time allow a little bit more of that density. And each half of the duplex is going to be less expensive than the one single family home. And so maybe it lets another a family move in there who otherwise couldn't afford to live in the area. And look, now the property owner has 2 incomes, and so it's kind of a win-win for everybody. Then the other side of it is, I think our view is that even if you let the market try to solve it, there's always going to be a contingent that isn't supported by that, right? In the same way that we have our sort of, there's any number of things, right? Healthcare, any number of things. We often have market solutions to it, but then there's a safety net for folks who the market isn't going to quite solve for. And so we do think that there's an important role for that as well. You see this work in and there's actually some interesting models in like Europe, where in Austria, where it's actually even mixed income. So somebody, 2 individuals could be living in a unit right next to each other, the same exact unit, and just what they pay depends on their income. And so that way you're not having segregated communities of just public housing in this corner and then market housing over here, but that your actual literal neighbors might have subsidized units and some don't have subsidized units. So we do think we need to just rethink the way that we've done public housing over the last really decades, and think more modern about how that can be done in a way that helps build communities up. But again, we think it's all of the above. And I think, and this is where we really, while we do focus on all of the above, there are groups out there, at least that I see, that are focused on that, what we might call capital A, capital H affordable housing, which is a messy term, but often when we talk about it, we mean housing that is designated and carved out for lower income people and has rules around who you can rent it to and for what cost. There are already groups doing that. They're doing good work on it. They're advocating for that. What we didn't see was anyone advocating for, let's loosen up the rules around the level of density that we can go build. And importantly, these conversations were being had, I'm sure, but it was oftentimes the builders who were having them, maybe the realtors associations who are having them. But we said, we think we can bring a new voice to the conversation, because look, I'm just a kid who loves Orlando. There's no interest in it for me other than improving our city. And so we wanted to be a voice in that conversation to highlight that, to say that this isn't just, maybe a lobbyist group who's lobbying for this because it's going to help their business, but that there's actually a societal good that's going to come of this. And so we wanted to bring that voice to the conversation. And so that tends to be where we focus our effort, is on loosening up some of those rules so that the market can come in and build some of this housing that's in such high demand.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of things you made me think. So now I've worked with, I live in the downtown area as well. We're in a historic district, so highly regulated. You want to touch anything, you got to go get approval. We're in approval process for something right now. But so there are some, existing duplexes in our area, right? Or even more. There's some, 6-7 unit properties nearby. What's happened, I mean, purely because of the inability to reclassify land for that use, is it drives the price up dramatically. And I've had this conversation with investors that it seems like an unreasonable, outrageous price that you're going to pay for these, but you could never create this again, right? In today's world. So no, I do see that. And, but there's also the argument that somebody buys that and splits it up into multiple, single families. And so it's really tough, because these conversations have been had for years for different reasons along the way, right? And they weren't experiencing the population boom we're experiencing now.
Yeah.
So I mean, it's extremely interesting. Now, regarding, isn't it hard to almost come at it from both perspectives, right? When the government gets involved, if they are putting money in a direction, it's going to influence what the developers are doing. That's already happened, right? I mean, that, like, we look at Section 9 housing, which is around for some of that purpose. And we've seen apartment developers develop for Section 9 housing specifically because of the funding that comes with it. And then as soon as that Section 9 requirement's over, they're eliminating it and raising prices and renovating, right? So it's going to be taken advantage of to some extent, but how do you reconcile the two?
Yeah, I mean, there's sort of rules to tweak, right? To say, okay, one, that needs to be affordable permanently, or again, we like the idea of this mixed income housing, where maybe you let a portion of it become market rate, but some of it stays affordable. Because again, I think a lot of historically in the United States, and I won't pretend to be a total expert on this, but from what I've observed and learned, a lot of the history here is that a lot of these more capital A, capital H affordable, publicly subsidized housing units have been group them all in the same neighborhoods, right? And so that there's really a segregated issue there, where what we want is to just have these integrated communities where you might not even realize that unit is subsidized. You have people paying market rate in there. So there's some things that you can do, I think, there. But the other thing is that, and this is important, I think, that I hit on for my friends who really focus a lot on that publicly subsidized housing, is that, the cost to build that is relative to the cost to build market housing. And so if the price that someone will pay for market housing continues to go up, then more and more builders are going to say, I'm just going to go build market housing. And you're going to have fewer builders who are even interested in building these affordable projects. Right. And oftentimes, the way it'll work is a housing trust fund. Like Orange County has a housing trust fund where they're going to essentially, this is a simple way to put it, but we'll buy at market rate that unit and then hold it such that it's going to be publicly subsidized through county dollars to be rented at a lower rate for a lower income person. Well, now they're paying market rate for it. And so in this sense, a rising tide lifts all boats. We'll kind of reverse. So a lowering tide lowers all boats. If we can get the market rate to get a little bit more under control, then actually our dollars go further when it's time to start thinking about the subsidized housing, because subsidized housing is it's not free. You're just shifting the dollars from private dollars to public dollars. And so we're paying that private price. And so that's why we continue to focus on getting the market rate down, because we think that that's going to affect not just folks who need that subsidized housing, but folks who don't as well are going to pay market rate. And that's another important point too. When we talk about affordable housing, I don't know if people fully appreciate how few people that is going to support. This is you're really certainly under median wage. Even then, there's often wait lists for it, and so I often see even friends of mine who make a decent salary. They're not making a ton of money, but they're median wage, maybe a little less, maybe a little bit more. Saying, oh, we've got to go build more affordable housing. With that, I don't think really appreciating that even if we built more, you're not going to be eligible for it.
Right.
So how are we building? And I'm of the belief that even someone making $60,000 a year should also live in a place that's affordable. And so how are we solving the problem for that person? Well, the government's not going to solve that for us, at least given the current makeup that we have. That's just not going to happen. There's not the infrastructure in place to go do that. If we wanted to go do that, that could take 20, 30, 40, 50 years for us to build out what that would look like they've done in other countries around the world. The reality of what we have today is that you're going to go live in market rate housing. And how are we going to bring that market rate down? Here's a set of solutions that we think can go do that. And so that's something we try to get people to realize a lot, is that the word affordable housing is thrown around all the time, but what does it mean? For most people, it's not going to apply. And so how can we find the market rate housing that works for them? That's where we need to look at some of these other solutions that we bring forward.
Do you have because you're right, the affordable is gray in everybody's sense, right? Regardless what your income is. So is there a calculation that says this is how much of someone's income should be required? What is that affordability ratio, so to speak?
Yeah, typically it's about 30% of someone's income should be used on housing. And so then what they'll do is they'll say, they might say, okay, this housing development right here, these units are going to be reserved for people who make at or below, say, 50% of median income, which in Orlando is about $60,000. So you can only rent this if you make $30,000 or less, it would say. And so then they'll just calculate, okay, what's that salary, 30% of that's going to be your monthly rental rate, and that's what you can't charge more of. And then there's different ways that the units, the building managers then have to report out, they're verifying income, they're holding rent at this level, and so it's reserved in that way. But that's what they're typically looking at, is they're making sure that people aren't paying more than 30% of their income. That's sort of the cardinal rule. And then they're looking at the median income of the area. So specifically, they're looking at the greater Orlando median income. So someone renting out a subsidized unit would look very different in Orlando than it would in San Francisco, where their median income is much higher than ours, then their rental rate would be higher as well. It's specific to us. So that's the way that they're looking at it. They're looking at median income of the area, and then they're trying to make sure that folks are spending about a third of their income on housing.
So I wish I had this ready to pull up on my computer, and I saved it the other day when I saw it. It's something I follow, and I thought it was interesting. And I'll just kind of walk through it here, but it says buyer income is still greater than required. It's kind of the header. It says median family income compared with qualifying incomes. This would be in regards to purchasing, not rents necessarily. So let's just do the US first. So the median family income in the US is $88,417. The qualifying income, this would be the income required to qualify to purchase, is $60,096, right? So there's still a pretty good gap there.
Yeah.
But again, we're a small segment in Central Florida, Orlando, right? Versus, the Midwest as an example. What I found interesting, and I'm just it's helping people talk through this when they're saying, why are my prices going up so fast? Because if we compare ourselves to where we're seeing, I've got a client right now coming from San Diego, buying a little, 1,800 square foot home here in Oviedo. And they are beside themselves excited, and they're paying what somebody in the neighborhood, there's no way they're getting that price, but they're beside themselves because they got a little backyard, they've got some nice little upgrades, it's a nice community. And it's funny because it's all perspective, but where they're coming from, the median family income is just under $95,000 a year. The qualifying income there is $85,000 a year. So that gap is very close compared to the US. But then here in the South, this is not Florida specific, it's just broken down to the Southern region. The median family income is $80,683. And the qualifying income required would be just under $55,000. So we still have a big gap, making me think that we're still rising, right? I mean, there's no way to look at that when we're still seeing the fleet from the West and the Northeast down to our area, where if they're overpaying, or, you know, if they're paying significantly more than the required qualifying rate, it's not hurting. They're not feeling that difference, but we are locally.
Yeah, it's a great point. And it's a story that we see more and more of this, you know, the movement into Florida, and some will say, oh, make it stop, right? I don't, my view is that growth can be a very good thing. The only thing worse than a growing region is a not growing region. And if you look around the US at regions that, you know, maybe factories were wiped out, or they had industries that are wiped out, and those are shrinking populations, areas with shrinking populations have a whole host of issues, especially if they're shrinking, not because of housing costs or anything, but just, you know, the industry is decaying. There's a lot of problems that come along with that. So growth can be good. We just have to know what to do with it. And that's a big if, though, right? Is if we know what to do with it. And so what we're trying to do is help cities, help counties think about what to do with it. Because this is in some ways, a new phenomenon for Orlando to have run out of, we're kind of running out of space, right? There's fewer places to, you know, clear cut and go put in a neighborhood. And at some point you just reach a critical point where, you know, people don't want to commute an hour and 20 minutes into work. And so at some point you reach a limit on that. And so what we're trying to help counties and cities think about is, where do you put that growth? And so this is something I like to say too, which is that housing is not procreation. Building a 100 unit apartment did not create 100 people. The people are coming. Where are we going to put them? Are we going to put them 3 miles from downtown, or are we going to put them 30 miles from downtown? Those are the only two options. So what are we going to pick? And when people sort of acknowledge that as much as you wish that no one moved into Orlando after everyone wishes they were the last one to ever move here. But as much as you wish that, it's not going to happen. So let's accept the fact. Let's be adults. Let's talk about what the actual solution will be. And you have two options. You either build it close or you build it far. And so we advocate, or I guess you don't build it at all. And now there's an affordability crisis, which is what we've picked. So we've got to build. And if we're going to build, where are we going to build? And we want to build more near our downtown. Even downtown Orlando itself, there's a bunch of parking lots, surface parking lots in downtown Orlando. We need to be putting housing in these places and doing it pretty fast here.
Yeah. So in regards to, you know, kind of government intervention here with impact fees, you know, because obviously that's how they, you know, at least whether they use it properly or not, plan for transportation and the impacts there and schools and all this. Is that a conversation y'all are having with the city of Orlando as an example? Like what's encouraging these parking lots to go vertical?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's been some work. I actually just saw a policy come through recently in the city of Orlando to reduce those impact fees for affordable projects. So again, it's incentivizing, even we're carving out, say 40% of the units to be affordable. So there's some things that you can do like that. There's, you know, my sort of pet policy idea. It's kind of an obscure one, and it doesn't happen in Florida. Nowhere in Florida do they do it, but they do it in Pennsylvania in some areas, and it helps with something like this. So I'll use this opportunity to share about it, even though I don't think there's a realistic chance of it happening here.
Throw some ideas at the wall, see what sticks.
That's exactly right. So maybe once you start talking about it, maybe there'll be something there. It's called a land value tax. Have you heard of that before? Okay, it's like I said, it's kind of obscure. And basically it's this, it's a different way to do property taxes than what a property tax is today. So property tax today, let's take two different plots of land next to each other in the city of Orlando. And one is a surface parking lot and one is a high rise. A property tax says, I'm going to tax you based on the value of the land and the value of the building. So that high rise pays a lot more in taxes than the surface parking lot does. A land value tax says, I'm only going to tax the value of the land. And your tax rate is going to be a little higher because we have to account for the fact that there's not as much building. And so now the parking lot and the high rise pay the exact same amount in in taxes, because their plots are right next to each other and they're worth the same amount of land. And so now how do I pay this tax bill on my parking lot in the middle of downtown? I better build a high rise. And by the way, that high rise isn't going to cost me any more in taxes. It's a tax-free high rise. I'm only going to pay the value of the land. I might as well build a high rise. And so it's a policy tool that helps encourage in these urban cores to build densely. Because if you don't build densely, you're paying the tax, you're not getting all that's worth of it. And so that's, you know, and there's ways to, you could say we're going to tax, maybe we're going to tax some of the building, but not as much. You could decouple them so your tax rate on the land is a little bit higher and tax rate on the building is a little bit lower. But it's a way, again, to reward building, to reward building in our core, because that's what we want in the cities. We want to build in our core, while kind of punishing people who just sit on land in the middle of a city. And if you're just sitting on land in a parking lot in hopes that one day it's worth more, or you just like the parking revenue, that's a waste of land in the middle of our city. And we'd rather you do something more productive with it. And so we're going to reward you. We're not going to tax the building. You go build a building and that'll be better for everybody. So that's kind of an obscure one, but they've tried it and they've had it in Pennsylvania for a few decades and in some parts of the world, and it seems to be successful.
Well, it's definitely, when you look at our tax bills here, it's land value and then building value and then your total assessed value. And so it is easier to evaluate just the value of the land, for sure. It's pretty standardized. Like each block has about the same per acre, you know, valuation. So the other thing I was going to ask, so like if you build something in the middle of downtown, let's just say you were building for very localized group of people, right? You're probably, you know, not families, not necessarily that you can, we don't discriminate, right? But you can guess who's going to be coming to the building based on where it is.
Yeah.
If you had less parking, you know, per unit, right? If they started reducing those, probably like you do in New York, where, you know, a parking spot is extremely expensive because there's so few per unit available. So it encourages walking or other forms of transportation. Why, in effect, would they be levying the same impact fees when these people probably aren't sending kids to school and they're probably not putting more cars on the road? You know, I know it's kind of somewhat backwards. And I know it's impossible to predict who's going to live here, but same thing with 55 plus communities. Why are they paying for the schools? You know, I don't know. It's interesting.
It's a great, especially when it comes to those transportation impact fees, like you said, you know, we don't have, because there's state rules around how you can levy them and stuff. And so we don't have a ton of flexibility, but in an ideal world, sure, what you would love to do is an impact fee on a house, you know, 20 miles east on Colonial should really be quite high, because the cost then of getting that person into where their job's going to be, you probably one day gonna have to widen Colonial or build a train line out there or something. That's really expensive. And by the way, you're going to need to build them roads to get to Publix and to get to schools, because you're going to be driving everywhere. Whereas an impact fee for transportation on a building that's on top of a Sunrail station should maybe be zero. I mean, the big train's already built. An impact fee is supposed to pay for the cost of the new person moving there. If they're walking and biking and taking the train and all that's already built out, there's really no impact. This is kind of exaggerated, but you would love that sort of flexibility to let it be a little bit more, you know, maybe some overlays that would indicate how close you are to this transit, and your impact fee would be much lower. You would definitely love to see something like that. We're a little limited in the kind of flexibility, but no doubt, you're exactly right. Is what's the impact fee supposed to pay for the impact, but it's kind of out of whack on how we're measuring those impacts. They kind of just take the regional average and apply it. There's some exception, you know, multifamily is less on a per unit basis than single family, but not nearly as much as you would expect based on the proximity to transit.
Yeah, it's prorated on a per unit basis, I guess.
Yeah,
right?
That's right.
I'm interested to hear about, you wrote in one of your articles, you spent the month of January either on foot or on bike or public transit. How'd that go? What stirred that up?
Well, you know, weather's beautiful in Florida in January, which is one of the things why it'd be hard anyway. So yeah, in the month of January, I went car free. I didn't use my car at all in the month of January. Again, I live fairly close to downtown, and so that's easier for me than for some others. I used the bus. There's a bus stop, you know, 4-minute walk from where I'm at. And honestly, what's that?
Did you know where the bus stop was before this started?
It's so funny. I was just about to say that. Is before that, I you know, probably drove by it, or even I biked by it, but didn't really pay that much attention to it. But so yeah, I learned about where the stops are and where they go. But I lived in Washington, D.C. for a few years, and I took the bus everywhere. And so I'm familiar with how to do it and the app and stuff like that. But I hadn't done it a whole lot in Orlando. So I had to learn where all that was at. But look, where I was at, it could get me most of where I wanted to go fairly easily, especially, you know, I'm comfortable on the bike. And so throw the bike on the front of the bus and could get almost anywhere. It would take me a little bit more time, but also I learned a lot more about the city while doing it. I learned shops that I hadn't noticed before. I figured out, where cross streets cut through and things like that. Even on the bus, when, yeah, I'm still moving as fast as a car, but I'm not focused on driving. I can just kind of look around, enjoy the scenery. I've noticed a bunch of restaurants that I had heard of for years and just didn't quite appreciate where they were at. You learn a lot about your city when you go about it in that way. And so I just wanted to do that. I wanted to learn about it a little bit more and see what it was like and see how hard it would be, how easy it would be. And look, there's no doubt I had to adjust what I was going to do. Right. Yeah. So if someone wanted to get coffee, I just would say, hey, I'm not going to meet you out by UCF. It'll take me 4 hours to get there. And so let's do it over here, or I can get here pretty easily. And so if you have the flexibility to be able to adjust what you're doing a little bit, it wasn't so bad. And I took Samuel with me sometimes, the 2-year-old. It's not that bad.
Very cool. So yeah, we're doing this via Zoom. How much impact do you think Zoom will have, or yeah, not Zoom, but the virtual world where, kind of been forced into over the last couple of years, which I like being in front of people, right? I like my people in the office. I like, but we've had to adapt. I mean, for many, many reasons. How do you think that impacts? And that's why I think we're seeing a lot of impact here in Orlando on our home values, is because people are choosing to work remotely. And why not live where you want to live and keep the job you had in San Francisco or, wherever it is?
This is the question of all the questions that people talk about in this space that I have the least amount of certainty about. Mm-hmm. I don't know. I think that it could go in a lot of different ways. I think you're right. One thing we're seeing for sure is that people who in more high cost of living areas, if they can work remote, they'd rather do it from sunny Florida. And so they're going to come down here and work remote. So I think that that's one thing for sure. I think a lot about how it cuts in two different ways. The other one I think about is, like we were talking about earlier, the little boroughs, right? The little neighborhoods on, if you are always in that neighborhood and you're working remotely, especially if you have a spouse and you're both working remotely, kids go to school just down the road. Do we see more families? We've talked about in our house going down to one car permanently between the two of us. Can you see more of that? If you don't need to do that long commute anyway, is that an opportunity to go do that and build out a little bit more there? And if that happens, by the way, people say Orlando's full. Orlando, when it feels crowded, at least in my view, I've never felt crowded by people. Sometimes you feel crowded by cars. And so if there are fewer cars, that does let you build a little bit more density and not quite feel the crowded nature of it. So that's one that I wonder how that shakes out. I don't have a good sense of it yet. The big unknown to me is what happens to our central business districts that are in downtown, especially a city like Orlando that is very much, the central business district at 6 p.m. is often very, very quiet, right? People have commuted out, and maybe it picks up again at 8 p.m. or something like that. But I do wonder what happens there. If those jobs clear out, how do they use that space? What happens to the lunch spots? Stuff like that. I don't have a good sense of that. But as a guy who loves cities and believes in cities, it gives me a little bit of pause. I do wonder what that does towards cities.
Yeah. Well, I think there's people that also love more space around them too, right?
Yeah.
So the ability to leave Manhattan, work remotely from your computer in Lake County, get 10 acres and,
totally.
So and we've seen every side of this, which is what's so fascinating, that it's allowing almost a new lifestyle for people that they never thought could exist with their career path. So yeah, I mean, it's super interesting, but that would allow the spread. Transportation's not solved with that. I mean, it would be a car requirement situation, but I'm right there with you. I don't know how it pans out long term. I think people are we're made for community to some extent. So I think there will always be a desire to be around people, but maybe only when you choose to. I don't know.
Yeah. I'm very, very curious to see how that pans out.
One of the things I was going to ask you mentioned, with a spouse that works. This is something I've kind of seen as we've seen values go up, right? Affordability to me has always been income level, coupled with the cost of ownership, right? So as we've seen more dual income households, we've also seen, a pretty dramatic increase in housing. And I don't know if you've read anything or kind of looked at this at all, but it certainly puts, single income housing or single income households at a disadvantage in this world where, there's oftentimes two spouses working, maybe one's working from home, but two incomes nonetheless.
Yeah, there's again, this one I'm not an expert on, but there is an economic phenomenon or theory, I guess, idea called the two income trap. And it's kind of an economic history of the US over the last few decades. And it's exactly what you're talking about, Justin. It's this idea, it's not making a statement on it, is this good or bad. It's just looking at the data and what we've seen over the last few decades as more and more houses, more and more families became two income households. Now there's more disposable income, and when there's more disposable income, it starts to drive prices up. People can afford a little bit more housing, so they're going to go buy more housing, and it drives the cost of housing up. The cost of a lot of different goods up and up. The cost of healthcare up, the cost of college tuition up. Right. As people get more wealthy, it drives the price of things up. That's just the nature of things. And so as more and more households in the 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s became two income households in the United States, the economic data says there's maybe something to that was what was driving a lot of the prices up. And so now the prices are up. And that's why they call it the two income trap. Now you're trapped. Now you need both incomes to have those things, and you don't have the option anymore to have a one income household. So there's a lot, more into it, the ways to look at that data and to think about it. But I think it's a provocative theory to think about maybe why we've seen some of this price increases over the last several decades, and what it's now necessitated in some cases for families to be two income households, just to have, people talk about a lot. In the 50s, you could just have one income in your household and you could buy a house and it was easy, and you can't do that anymore. And there actually might be a causal effect there, but because there's so many two income households, it made the prices more expensive. Right. And now families need that. So I'm not an expert on that, but it's a provocative theory that maybe some folks can check out. I think
it probably also increased the gap, right? Because when you have a two income household, now you've got childcare person, right? Who's certainly at a different wage level. It almost creates more need for lower income service industry type, widening that gap from household to household. So
that's an interesting thought. Yeah, there's a whole book about it. I should read the book, but I wonder if I talk about that, because that's a really good.
I just remember my wife and I were driving from where we're going from LA down to San Diego on the Pacific Coast Highway. We stopped in Laguna Beach, which is, if you've not been through Laguna Beach, it is everything you can imagine, right? It's just beautiful, like, $100 million mansions on the coastline. But we're at this restaurant and you look around and you're like, where do the people that work here possibly live? And we ended up asking, and the girl's like 3 hours that way, essentially over the mountains into the desert kind of situation. And, it's just, it's crazy, but that wealth creates, somebody willing to drive there for that kind of work. You just hope you don't get to that here. But I don't know, I don't have a dog in the fight trying to manage outcomes. I think it's interesting to kind of talk about some of these things that we're seeing as time goes on.
Yeah, but we do think about that in housing context, no doubt, on, again, going back to what is a community and what policies are in place that are building those sorts of communities is, we just want, and this is where, going back earlier, we talked a little bit about who's this for and who's benefiting from it. And a lot of people think, oh, I'm a homeowner, this doesn't affect rising home prices. That's actually great for me. I don't mind that. But not only are, one, if you ever wanted to move, now you might feel stuck because there's nothing else for you to move to, but also who's in your neighborhood? Are you able to have the folks working in service sectors to support the businesses that you want? We see this in Orlando. Part of, there's restaurants you can't open because there aren't workers who will work there. Sometimes they can't afford to live near here. And so if they live out in Lake County, they're just going to go work at the Chipotle in Lake County because that's where they're living already. And so they just rather go work there instead. Can the teachers live in the communities that they teach in? Can law enforcement, can firefighters, can all these occupations live where they work? we want to make sure that they can. And more, I worry that the answer to that might be no.
I will say I've talked to many teachers and law enforcement that want nothing to do with living
Fair
in this
enough.
community. So
Yeah, fair enough.
put them in neighboring community, you know?
Yeah.
Like I do not want to see my students when I'm out to dinner, you know?
Work-life balance. Yeah, I guess that's
So I appreciate you doing this. And if somebody wants to like connect with you or look into this further or check out YIMBY, where do they do that?
Yeah, so they should check out orlandoyimby.org. They can sign up for our newsletter. We do a monthly newsletter that just kind of does a roundup of what we're up to, what's going on in the news. We won't spam you too much, really just one a month, maybe two. And then on there too, you can find, we've got a Facebook page, a Twitter page. If people want to connect with me, they can find me on LinkedIn, on Facebook, on Twitter. Find me on there, connect me there. I'll chat with anybody about this stuff anytime, whether you agree or disagree. Just have an opinion, and that makes for a good conversation. So I'm always happy to do that too.
Awesome. Hey, Austin, I appreciate it, man. This was fun.
Yeah, thanks so much, Justin. I had a good time.
Yeah, you got it.